Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our fifth webinar in the series, Learning from Connected Communities, an in-depth look at nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. My name is Lily Barraclough, and I am project coordinator with the New Brunswick Environmental Network on a project supporting municipalities to build capacity around implementing nature-based climate solutions. Today's webinar is on the topic of living shorelines. I'm really excited to have our speakers, Lauren and Maddie, here to share their knowledge with us today. Bonjour tout le monde.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our today's webinar. It's part of a series of webinars, Learning from Connected Communities, an in-depth look at nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. This webinar, it's the fifth one in the series. It's on the topic of living shorelines. And we'll learn from our speakers today, Lauren and Maddie, from the Town of Mahone Bay and the Town of Stratford in PEI. My name is Lily Barraclough, and I am the coordinator of the project. It's in support of New Brunswick municipalities to help them institute nature-based climate solutions.
We have simultaneous interpretation available today. Both presentations will be in English, but during the question period, you are welcome to pose questions in the language of your choice. If you would like to hear all audio today in this event in English, including all the questions, you can go find the globe icon on the menu on your screen and select English. Si vous voulez entendre
If you would like to hear all of the session today in French, you can click on the interpretation button on the bottom to the right and select French to listen to the event today in French.
Please remember to pose questions if you're posing them out loud in the language of the channel that you're on. Before we get started with our presentations today, I would like to acknowledge that this work is taking place on the unceded traditional territory of Mi'kmaq, where I'm currently located, but the New Brunswick Environmental Network and the work that we're talking about today it takes place, in Mi'kma'ki, as well as here in New Brunswick. We also work on the territory linguistic and Passamaquoddy peoples. And when we discuss adapting and mitigating climate change, particularly through efforts that are focused on nature-based solutions, it's incredibly important to acknowledge that reconciliation and decolonization is a part of responding to the climate crisis. And particularly when we are looking towards solutions that work more directly with nature and ecosystems, we are building on a lot of traditional ecological knowledge from the Indigenous peoples across this land. So I hope we keep this in mind as we move forward in the discussions and learnings today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, the New Brunswick Environmental Network is a communication network established in 1991, and we link over 110 nonprofit environmental organizations in New Brunswick. This webinar series is hosted by us here at the NBEN, as well as CLIMAtlantic and Nature New Brunswick. And we have a long history here at the network of working on nature-based climate solutions. And the last thing I'll mention before I pass it over to our fantastic speakers is that this is a webinar, a part of this series of webinars, and this is the fifth one. So you have already had quite a few. If you missed them and you're interested, the recordings are available on our YouTube channel. And we do have one more that's scheduled after this, and I actually forgot to update this slide because we just updated the date today, but our next one is on July 17th. From 12 to 1 p.m. and it's on wetlands and naturalized stormwater retention ponds, where we'll be hearing from the experiences in Dieppe and Sackville, New Brunswick. And we will have one likely in early fall, focused on really conservation of nature as a method of responding to climate change. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Lauren Clark. Lauren recently moved to the South Shore of Nova Scotia to work for the innovative town of Mahone Bay. And she has previously worked in the environmental nonprofit sector and has volunteered across Canada. And I'll let her tell you a bit more about the work that she does, and I'll pass it along to her now. Welcome, Lauren, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Lily. Let me just share my screen. All right. 1 second. There we go. Great. Yeah, so like,
sorry, Lauren, before you get started, you'll want to do that, change the display setting, because we are seeing your note.
oh, okay, thank you. I wasn't sure. Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Lily. Yeah, so like Lily was saying, my name is Lauren Clark, and I'm the Climate and Energy Program Manager for the Town of Mahone Bay. So Mahone Bay, for those of you who don't know, is a small town of just over 1,000 people on the South Shore of Nova Scotia. And I'm joining from Mi'kmaq, specifically the Stephenakity region, which translates to where the wild potatoes grow. And my presentation today is on the Mahone Bay living shorelines. So I do want to highlight, as I get started, Coastal Action. So Coastal Action are a nonprofit environmental organization based in Mahone Bay, and they are the project managers for our Living Shoreline project. They work mostly in the South Shore region of the province, and they have been around for nearly 30 years now, and their main mission is to protect and restore the environment. So we're very thankful that we have them in our region. They've done a lot of great work, including this living shoreline. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, I just wanted to go over quickly what is a living shoreline. So a living shoreline is a piece of natural infrastructure that uses native plants to prevent the coast from eroding. These native plants trap sand and topsoil, and they also absorb energy from the waves. Another definition of a living shoreline could be a protected, stabilized coastal edge made of natural materials such as plants, sand, and/or rocks. So why did we want a living shoreline in Mahone Bay? Why were we interested? So you can see from the little map I have on the left-hand side that it's highlighted very nicely in yellow. Two of our main streets in Mahone Bay are right along the harbor. So that's Edgewater Street and Main Street. And that is essentially the commercial district of Mahone Bay. And you can see from the photos in the center and on the right that the shoreline along Edgewater Street is eroding. So you can see some exposed tree roots, a bit of unstable road embankment. And so this is one of the reasons that we were interested in the living shoreline, because it is right along the harbor, because the road is right there, and because it is eroding. So the idea of a living shoreline was first presented in a report by CBCL done in 2016. And this report outlined some options for the Mahone Harbor in terms of flood prevention and shoreline enhancement. And one of the ideas for the living shoreline outlined in the report was to put a living shoreline along the entire Edgewater Street section that borders the harbor. And so I've taken this screenshot from an interactive map that is available online. So a company called 3D Wave Design Mapping Solutions took the idea and designs from the CBCL report. They had some funding from RBC Tech for Nature, and they created an interactive 3D online map with the entire 700 meters of living shoreline along Edgewater Street. So this is the entire vision that was outlined in the report. The section with the red icons that you can see on the left is the 60-meter pilot project that has been constructed. But I just wanted to show you what the living shoreline can do and what its purpose is near the beginning. So what I did, and some of the options in the interactive map, is I gave it a scenario. So I actually removed the living shoreline from the interactive map. You can still see the 3 icons there, but there is actually no living shoreline there. So I removed the living shoreline and I said, give me a 1 meter high tide and 2 meters of storm surge. And you can see the water up over the road. You can see it in the gas station area. For those familiar with Mahone Bay, this is the area where the 3 churches are. So you can see the flooding, you can see it's not great. And then what I did with the map is I put the living shoreline back in, and it has the same scenario. So the same 1 meter high tide and the 2 meter storm surge. And you can see that although the living shoreline is covered in water, the road is dry and the 3 churches area is dry, and so is the gas station area. So just wanted to show that sort of before I got into more details about the living shoreline that we have so far. So I just wanted to go over a little bit of the process that Coastal Action went through in order to have this 60-meter living shoreline pilot that we have now. So Coastal Action applied for and acquired funding. They conducted a geotechnical study, secured plants for the project, applied for permits. They developed a project website, signs, and a community outreach plan. And they also prepared tender documents, hired contractors, and then construction started, and then construction ended. I just wanted to also give a little bit of a visual timeline. So in 2016, as I already mentioned, the idea of the living shoreline was proposed to the town by CBCL in their Mahone Harbor Flood Prevention and Shoreline Enhancement Plan. In 2020, Coastal Action received funding from the Intact Foundation for a 3-year project. And then last summer, so June to August of 2022, is when the living shoreline was constructed. And so I want to highlight some of the partners that were instrumental in the project. So CBCL, as I already mentioned, they are our engineering and design partner. Transcoastal Adaptations is a center for nature-based solutions. So they are coastal restoration experts, and they are based out of St. Mary's University. And then CB West are leading experts in coastal wetland restoration. And then, of course, the Town of Mahone Bay. And generous funders for the project include the Intact Foundation, TD, and the Arbor Day Foundation. So I want to take you through some of the details around the construction and the components of the living shoreline. So obviously the picture on the left is before the living shoreline, and then the picture on the right is the living shoreline installation. So there are 3 main components of our living shoreline: rock fill, tidal marsh, and vegetated bank. And I'm going to go through those in a bit more detail. So the rock sills are a hard engineering structure that usually run parallel to the shoreline. Rock sills help reduce wave energy and storm surge impact. So the ones we have are gapped rock sills, and they allow for better habitat connectivity for animals. They also dissipate wave energy and provide habitat and ecosystem services. The tidal marsh fills the area between the rock sill and shoreline with planted native species. So tidal wetlands naturally filter stormwater runoff, reduce storm surge and wave energy. They additionally create valuable coastal habitat for fish and bird species. So some of the plants in this area were actually rescued from a salt marsh that was being removed at the time. And other plants actually had to be grown from seed because there weren't a lot of options locally for some of these plants that were needed for the tidal marsh. Some of those plants include Spartina alterniflora and cordgrass. And finally, the vegetated bank. So the vegetated bank is a graded area that's been planted with native shrubs and herbaceous perennials. And the vegetated bank helps to stabilize the soil. So this is a picture kind of close up of the vegetated bank on planting day. And this is a photo of the tidal marsh, kind of a close up. You can see kind of from the picture that the water does come up into the tidal marsh and into the plants, which is a totally natural process, and it was designed that way. Yeah. So I just want to go over some of the challenges that we experienced with the project. So those include some delays with permits and geotechnical studies. So the crowned land permit took 10 months to complete and receive approval because the regulatory agencies that were reviewing the permit application had never received an application for a project like that before, and they weren't sure of how to deal with it. Additionally, a geotechnical study was required to ensure that the soils could withstand the load-bearing capacity needs for the project. And this needed to be completed before the engineered design could be finished and before the construction process could begin. And this had not been part of the original discussions and was therefore not included in the original budget. So due to those two items, the project was off schedule by a year. And then when Coastal Action put out a tender for construction in January of 2022, they were told by all of the contractors that their budget would not be sufficient. And in fact, it would need to be doubles because of COVID and supply chain issues. So the funders were very generous and accommodating because of those reasons, and were able to accommodate that. But that was definitely a challenge that was encountered. And now some successes. So we have a 60-meter pilot living shoreline. The reaction from the community was overwhelmingly positive. Council was very supportive. Our living shoreline has survived Hurricane Fiona, which is great. It is continuing to be monitored. So Transcoastal Adaptations have been doing a study looking at how it fared over the winter, as the combination of a freeze-thaw cycle and living shorelines has not been extensively examined, especially in our region. And they will be sending us a report on that soon. Additionally, we have been looking for more funding in order to extend the living shoreline along Edgewater Street. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. I have a link at the top for the Mahone Bay Living Shoreline website, where we'll post updates and have information. I also encourage you to check out the 3D wave design interactive map that I showed earlier. And yeah, that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a fantastic presentation. For all participants, we will be keeping our question period until the end after both presentations, but feel free to write your questions in the chat as we go. And once we get to the question period, we'll look back and read out the questions in the chat. So next, I would like to introduce Madeleine. Madeleine Crowell is the Environmental Sustainability Coordinator for the Town of Stratford, PEI, where she coordinates municipal environmental programs, policies, and initiatives across all departments. She previously worked for and now works closely the nonprofit Stratford Area Watershed Improvement Group. And with that, I will pass it along to Maddie.
Thanks, Lily. I too will share my screen here. So, are you seeing the right thing there, Lily, or?
Yep. I am seeing your speaker's notes, so you might want to do the same thing that Lauren did with the changing your display settings.
Okay, I'll just do this.
It's good like it is now, actually.
Yeah.
Still okay right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
All right.
perfect right now.
All right. Okay, thanks for that introduction. My name's Maddie, and I'm going to chat a little bit about living shorelines in Epiquid or PEI, and ours are centered around the Charlottetown Stratford area, so the central part of PEI. I'll jump right in. I'm going to talk today about a project called Community-Based Climate Action Project, but I've thrown in a fourth living shoreline in there as well that got completed in the same year. So for the most part, this is one major project consisting of 3 living shorelines components, but just note that there is another one I threw in there just because I thought it was worth talking about. So it was a 1-year project funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada and coordinated by a number of people. So I'm certainly not the main coordinator for this project. There was a whole slew of people involved, and probably too many to name, but I was there for all of it and along for the planning and the implementation and the follow-up. So I can speak to most of it, but there may be some questions at the end that I might connect you to someone else to kind of find the information you need. So I think I'll just get right into the first shoreline, and I'm pretty picture heavy on my presentation because I think that's probably what people learn best from. The project, I'm just talking about the components with the living shorelines, but the entire project did involve some art installations and some art performances, signage installations, a speaker series. So there were components to this that were aimed at just creating awareness and education around living shorelines. Because this is really sort of a first look at this type of nature-based infrastructure in PEI. And I should say involvement, I have some acknowledgement at the end, but most heavily involved in this project were local watershed groups, the Local Watershed Alliance, the organizations that helped us design them, and then the municipalities as well. So our first site here, and I have a little map up there to kind of show roughly where we are. On the top left corner of that map is Charlottetown, and then the rest is Stratford. So the first site here is over in Charlottetown, and that's by the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And The reason the site was chosen was because we were there was concern about erosion, and right where you can see those vehicles, there's a walking path and a road, and beyond that, the hospital. So this low wall, seawall of gaving baskets with riprap wasn't quite doing the trick, and there was erosion on either end and overtopping it. So definitely we're looking to have some sort of solution there, and that was selected as the first site for a living shoreline. This was a 3-day installation over the course of a week because there was delays and weather and whatnot. Over 25 volunteers, contractors, and different pieces kind of coming together for this one. So I'll walk through some of the pictures on the install here. So essentially the gaving baskets were removed, the riprap was removed, and the slope was graded, or the coast was graded back into a gentle slope, aimed at absorbing that wave energy rather than waves coming at a flat surface and then just directing that energy elsewhere and causing erosion. So sloped back, very, very large logs placed perpendicular to the slope to try and trap some of that sediment that's moving down the beach and retain it in place. And then just popping ahead here, sort of terracing done through logs and staking and establishing plants and mulching done on the face of the slope just to stabilize that and get plants growing, and then a lot of native planting at the top of the bank, and a bit of native sandstone placement as well. So this was probably the most technically complex site because it required so much heavy equipment and so many different materials and such a long implementation time. But it's doing fairly well. All of our sites, of course, got hit by Hurricane Fiona, and we continue to monitor them and do work to restore and repair them after that. But this one, I think mostly the damage that we're seeing is happening at the toe of the slope. So a bit was added down at the lowest portion afterwards to try and protect that a little bit more. But for the most part, this site held up pretty well. So that was a pretty interesting one. Oops, sorry, jumping far ahead here. And that's the finished look of it there. So this is a pretty heavily used area for the public, and so there was signage put in and some seating areas, and we also established a separate pathway down to the shore because people, really like to access the beach from a lot of different places, and previously they had been going over top, and we didn't want them walking through the living shoreline while it was establishing, so we also directed that foot traffic elsewhere. So the second site, and this is the one that I've thrown in that's not part of the funded project, the main project that I'm talking about, was a private piece of land that the local Stratford watershed group decided to do with some funding, working with this private landowner, after having done the 3 other sites and learned from that and felt like they could sort of branch out and do a living shoreline project on their own with what they'd learned. And so this is obviously a site that definitely had some erosion concerns. We had a lot of overland flow coming off of this. You can't really tell in the photo, but it's a sloped bank running down to the coast and quite closely mowed. So basically providing a nice flat surface for that water to run off and essentially erode the bank from the top rather than the bottom, which is what we mostly think of. So this family was quite keen to have a living shoreline put in place. I don't have a lot of pictures from the install, but I just had a few here showing the before and after of Hurricane Fiona. So in the pre-Fiona photos, you can see on the top left one, that's what the living shoreline had established as before the hurricane. So growing pretty well, definitely produce a lot of plant cover for that slope, starting to establish some grasses and some native plants. And then I think the intention was probably to plant some shrubs. And so this year we're having to repair the damage first, but post Fiona, you can see it actually held up somewhat. We definitely got hit hard here on PEI, but still the living shoreline, you know, it wasn't completely obliterated. There's definitely still parts of it there. And compared to the control site, we think that it did actually protect the shoreline during the hurricane as well. So I'll move on to a third site here. This is on the Stratford waterfront. Again, a pretty tall, steep bank, bare exposed ice soil, highly erodible. You can see just on the edge of this photo here on the top left photo where you can see someone sitting, there's an armor stone sort of toe wall from an adjacent property that ends, and that's of course where you see a lot of the erosion because the energy just gets directed right to that soft exposed bank. And so this was a section in particular that we wanted to protect because this is up above it. You can't see, but it's a park area and there's some intended work done to sort of enhance this as a public space. So the site was chosen for that reason. And we used this site as a bit of a workshop where we had at least 30 volunteers from various watershed groups and local organizations come out and help us install this site and basically learn as they did that. So for this site, we had an organization I'll mention at the end help us design it, and then all of these volunteers implement. So just a bit on the install. Using logs to create these chevrons, so attaching them to the face of the slope using stakes and twine, and then filling them with various materials and intended to make sort of a terrace so that you could actually plant plants. You can't just stick a plant straight into the slope. You need something to sort of anchor it and stabilize it and provide it with a space to grow. So that was the intention behind those. And again, hit by Fiona, but held up pretty well despite that. And then jumping ahead to our fourth site. So this is Tea Hill Park in Stratford, and a couple different issues here. We have in one portion of the coast here, a seawall. You can see in the photo on the left, definitely, you know, past its prime and just a concrete slab made up of blocks that's sort of slowly tipping forward as the bank behind it pushes against it. And so we're seeing it's overtopping and a lot of the erosion coming in behind it. And so the materials moving laterally behind the seawall and eroding from behind. So we installed some logs vertically to help prevent the movement of materials in behind, and planted that out. And then on a lower portion, we did a lot of hay bale staking, log staking, and native species planting. I think I have in the next photo here. Yeah. Another issue with this site was it was really heavy foot traffic, a really popular park for people to come and access the beach. So it looks like a nice pathway now, but beforehand, without that sign and the fencing and the wood chip pathway put in place, it was really being compacted quite a bit by foot traffic, and there was no sort of delineated way to get down to the beach. And so it was all subject to foot traffic and erosion that way, and compaction, and you know, that then not allowing plants to grow up underneath. And a lot of those trees there are just old white spruce that a lot of them aren't there anymore, or, you know, aren't meant to last a long time. So we knew that planting the shoreline here with trees and shrubs was also important. So we established a wood chip path and fenced off the area around that to try and prevent walking through the other areas, and put some signage up. So that was definitely a big thing for this site. And then the plan is to make it a little bit more accessible, and we'll be installing a beach mat for some, you know, accessibility for anyone using a wheelchair or anything like that. And then I just wanted to mention that we went through a process to pick these sites, and it does, you know, matter a little bit which ones you choose. And we looked at a few that just weren't suitable. So there's going to be a number of different reasons that you might not pick a site for a living shoreline, and these are a couple examples. So The one on the left, the landowner was really interested in having a living shoreline put in place, but we noticed there was nesting bank swallows, and so we certainly couldn't work during their nesting season, and we also just didn't want to at this time take away from that habitat, as that's important bank swallow habitat. And then on the right, potentially a good spot for a living shoreline, but that landowner, the future land use was so uncertain, we didn't want to go to the effort of putting the work in with a living shoreline and not knowing, what might become of it or what might be happening upslope afterwards. So we didn't select that location. So I'll just talk a little bit about some challenges with projects like these. Of course, one of the biggest challenges is just a new type of project for BEI. So there's not a lot of knowledge on hand locally. Most of the participants, or most of those involved in organizing the project and carrying it out, did take part in some Green Shores training. So understood the concepts that we were putting in place, and from that training, it took away sort of the main things that you might need to know, but we certainly needed to consult with experienced organizations on the actual design and implementation. Of course, the challenge is coordinating a lot of different players, so volunteers, contractors, designers and planners and staff, nonprofit organizations, municipalities, getting land permissions. So definitely a lot of that type of organization and coordination. And of course, COVID was going on at the time. And definitely a timeline. I would say this was quite a short timeline for what we ended up undertaking. So probably could have used many more months of planning and a bit more time for implementation as well. But I think in the spirit of watershed groups, they're pretty good at getting things done. So we pulled it off, but definitely could have used a longer timeline on the project. I guess I will just jump ahead to lessons learned. So just a couple notes, I guess, that I took away from these projects. As I mentioned, longer timeline. So assessment planning, things don't always happen when you think they're going to happen. Weather matters. You need permissions, like Lauren had said in her presentation. So you definitely have to account for a lot of these things. And then just the sheer work involved. So we were fortunate that we did have, a lot of watershed staff on hand and other staff and volunteers to implement, but don't underestimate how much work that is on the ground, hands-on work. Planning, so planning for, and that means budgeting and making time in subsequent years for maintenance, assessment, and follow-up. Definitely important. These aren't, at this point at least, something that you can put in place and just walk away from. And then if you have a budget, working with a knowledgeable organization is a really good way to go. I think it's a learning opportunity, and it's, if you don't have the experience and the know-how, a way to ensure that what you're putting in is the right thing to be putting in. And then just some acknowledgements that I could have perhaps mentioned throughout, but there's just so many. The two main groups that worked on the design for these projects were Helping Nature Heal and CB West and Transcoastal. So they were behind sort of the design and a lot of the implementation as well. As I said, Environment and Climate Change Canada were the major funders. We worked alongside Creative PEI, the Mi'kmaq Confederacy, PR Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Change on this project, all involved. Of course, Stratford and Charlottetown with most of the land permissions and staff assistance. UPI Climate Sense program, I believe funded by NRCan, provided us with a lot of interns who did a lot of the research and legwork on these projects. And of course, the watershed groups provided a lot of the manpower for these as well, and a bit of funding from Climate Action and Awareness Fund. So a lot of parts to play, a lot of partners and people at play in this project. And I didn't include anything too much on budget, as these all, would have had somewhat of their own budget. But if anybody would like to know some information on costs and how much was, required for each of these shorelines or the project as a whole, they can get in touch with me and I can kind of give you a breakdown or connect you to someone who knows perhaps a bit more. And that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maddie. This was really wonderful presentation. Now we'll move on to questions. So we got a couple in the chat for Lauren. Please do keep putting your questions in the chat to follow up from Maddie's presentation and any others for Lauren. And you can also raise your hand if you would like to ask your question out loud. But first we'll start with a question from Fraser. Hi, Lauren. Can you say more about your community engagement process? What consultations were necessary? Was the community supportive throughout, or were there a range of responses?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Fraser, for your question. So the community engagement was done during the creation of the CBCL report. So in that report, there are documented community engagement responses and stuff from the community. And the community response has been widely positive. Like I said, there was some confusion initially, as it is an innovative project, and some people kind of thought that it was an infill project. But once, there was some education around what a living shoreline is, and like Madeleine was saying, it is such a new thing. Once there was some education out about what was going on, those concerns were resolved.
Great. Thank you. I'll go to a question for Maddie next and then jump back to the ones directed at Lauren. So a question for you, Maddie. You mentioned some associated arts exhibitions and programming. Can you share more on those and any affiliated process there?
Yeah, we because we were working with interns from the Climate Sense program, I believe this was the connection. One of those interns was with Creative PEI, so connecting climate change and the arts community and representing climate change through art. So that is how this project ended up having that component. And each of these sites, the three that were part of this project, had an art component to it. One was a performance and the other two were installations, and they were coordinated through Creative PEI.
Sounds really neat. So next question for Lauren. It seems like the idea of the CBCL report in 2016 was the origin of this project. What was the trigger for that report? I.e., why did CBCL do the report in the first place? Had the town requested a consult on its waterfront infrastructure?
Yeah, for sure. So there was a community committee that the town had created to look at coastal adaptation. And that was around 2014, 2015, I believe. And so it was that committee that gave rise to the CBCL report. And then from then, the selection of the living shoreline. So it would have been a committee of council, I believe, that probably made a recommendation to council, to have a report done on options in terms of flood mitigation and the erosion and that kind of thing. So then that out of that report again came the living shoreline. But yeah, it was that initial community committee that was created by the town.
Great, thank you for that response. And a question for Maddie, although you both might have some response to this as well. Have you seen any damage from ice uprooting plants, and what kind of measures would you put in place if you know? Like maybe some larger rocks deeper into the water to break or disrupt the ice path or something like that.
I think that's a neat idea with larger rocks in the water. You might just have to look at how that sort of affects sediment movement and wave energy, but it's not something that I have noticed with our sites, but there's others who do monitor our sites who may have seen that. I can follow up if you'd like. But I guess one thing is that our sea ice in PEI in the winter is a lot less than it used to be, and sometimes we're two of these projects, at least three of them, were on the Hillsborough River, the mouth of the Hillsborough River. So especially more in the harbor there, we see a lot less than we ever used to. So it's becoming less of an issue, perhaps, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I can just say, like, I haven't seen ice uprooting plants or anything like that. And again, I think it has to do with the warmer climate we're experiencing. Like there was that really cold day last winter, but overall we didn't have a lot of cold weather. Certainly a lot more precipitation than usual, but that's sort of across the board. And so, yeah.
And this is a question to you, Lauren. Is the tidal marsh substrate composed mainly of sand?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, it is. But I'd be happy to like look into that for you. So if you want to shoot me an email, I have a contact with Coastal Action that I'd be happy to connect you with and double check. But to my knowledge, it is mostly composed of sand. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? That I'm not seeing any others in the chat, but participants also feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. Also, Maddie or Lauren, if you have any questions for each other, feel free to ask as well.
I did just want to clarify that we got very lucky with Fiona and like did not get hit directly. So I think that has a lot to do with why the Living Shoreline did okay. It's because it did not go directly through Mahone Bay. Not that like, you know, ours was like, it's well built, but I mean, hurricanes are, you know, pretty destructive. So I think the reason we were not impacted so much by that is again, because it didn't go directly through us. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I'll just point out something from the chat. Someone had mentioned bank swallow habitat, and had a map there of Stratford and Charlottetown, and the site that I had pointed out where there was bank swallow habitat is just on the very west edge of that portion of the map in Stratford. So yeah, definitely a good point to check species at risk critical habitat maps where you're working.
Just got a couple more questions in the chat. One for Maddie regarding the costs and how the projects were funded, but I know you mentioned that you might be more interested in discussing that with folks over email. So it's also like, if you have anything quick you want to add here, or if you want to ask the person asking the question if they can send you an email, that's fine either way. It's up to you.
Yeah, I would be happy to share more by email. I think off the top of my head, roughly the 3 sites that were part of our main project, plus the additional components and some things I didn't mention that went beyond the scope of just living shorelines, was about 300,000. And of course, that's with a lot less, construction or hard armoring, or some of the bigger components that Lauren's had. But I can break that down if you want some more specifics. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And a question for both of you. Was local Indigenous consultation a requirement for either project or any of the multiple projects in PI?
Yeah, I am not sure about that. Like I wasn't around for the construction of the project. Like I just arrived in this position in October, but I'd be happy to look into that for you. Feel free to send me an email as like a reminder, and I'd be happy to look at that, but I'm not sure.
I guess a short answer is we did have consultation, but I don't know if it was a requirement.
And a question back to the funding piece, Maddie. do you know which Environment and Climate Change Canada program funded the work he did? A couple mentioned Eco Action and Nature Smart Climate Solutions, if it was either of those.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure that out now. I might circle back to you. Just give me 1 minute and I'll find it.
Yeah, that's no problem. Are there any other questions that are coming up for folks?
Sorry, it looks like Climate Action
Okay.
and Awareness Fund.
Awesome. Thank you for finding that, Maddie. Well, I guess I think I'm maybe both spoke a little bit to this, but before we kind of wrap up, I'm curious, what are you working on right now in terms of the living shorelines, and kind of like in moving forward, is there like future expansion? Maybe you could speak a little bit to that and give folks an idea of what that might be looking like for your communities.
Yeah, so I can go. So yeah, so we are looking for additional funding in order to expand the living shoreline along that entire stretch of Edgewater Street. So that is something that Coastal Action and the town are pursuing, because ideally, in order to get the full benefit and protection of the living shoreline, you really need it to be along the entire edge there. So that is something that we're looking to do and actively pursuing. No announcements yet, but yeah, we're looking to do that for sure.
I'll maybe try and speak to a few different groups, but from the town of Stratford, I would love to install more living shoreline projects. I don't have any funding right now for them. I believe the PEI Watershed Alliance is continuing the work of educating watershed groups and the public and looking for, perhaps doing further projects, living shorelines projects. With this one, they had done some reef ball work. And then the Stratford Watershed Group, I know, is always looking for more opportunities. They had hoped to work with sort of a collection of landowners, but I'm not sure on the funding on that project. So definitely something that, we all know quite a bit about now and are looking to continue the work, but it still requires funding. It still requires, all of the same work that our first projects did. So just continuing to try and push that concept of nature-based infrastructure through living shorelines.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your presentations today and your thoughtful answers, and being willing to answer questions after this event as well. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on living shorelines. This was fantastic to learn more about the work in Mahone Bay and in different parts of PEI as well. And we do have living shorelines here in New Brunswick. And quite a lot of work being done on the northern coast. And so I encourage you to also check out other projects, and in the future, hopefully illustrate even more examples. But with that, I thank you so much again for attending. The recording of this webinar will be available on the NBEN YouTube in the upcoming week. And the recordings of past webinars are also available there. And we do have a couple more coming up, as I mentioned at the beginning. So stay tuned, and hopefully look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is July 17th on wetlands and naturalized stormwater retention ponds. My colleague Beckett has shared the link to more information on the series in the chat. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Merci.
Lily.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.